I'm so glad that Ella spoke about Tu B'Shvat, a joyful holiday on the near horizon, and Cantor Rosen might have a chance to tell us, or maybe for announcements we'll hear a little bit about Shabbat Shira, another joyful occasion on the near horizon. But unfortunately, I have the responsibility to call attention to heavier facts on the ground these days. Yesterday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, when we remember the 6 million. And as yesterday turned to Shabbat, and Jews gathered in synagogues across Jerusalem, 7 were gunned down while praying. These are enough to turn our hearts to stone. Jewish law does not advocate for turning the other cheek. Jewish law calls for self-defense because life is precious. Israel has retaliated with a counterattack, killing 10 known terrorists. The response was measured and strategic, predictable, and painful. A person can only live with a beating heart made of flesh and blood, not of stone. And so we must protect the heart from the attacks that can come from the outside and from the attacks that can come from within. As difficult as it is to protect from external threats, it can be even more challenging, even more painful to do what we must to protect from internal threats. We pray that the violence in Israel will escalate no further. And we can pause now in the quiet of this sanctuary on this Shabbat to ask one another, how do we protect against the corroding and calcifying of our hearts? On the very personal plane, on the societal plane, and yes, on the political plane. How do we protect against the corroding and the calcifying we see in some of the hearts of some of the leading representatives of this current government of Israel? We must ask this question because when the heart hardens from within, you die. We learned this from Pharaoh. In last week's Torah portion, it is written, Vayechazak lev Paro, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he would not listen. We read Kabed lev Paro. Pharaoh's heart was heavy with stubbornness, and he refused to set the people free. And that brought the river of blood. And into this week's Torah portion, we notice, if we read carefully as we did this morning in our Torah study before the service, there's a slight shift in the language. Vayechazek Adonai et lev Paro. As the plagues unfold, it is written that God hardened Pharaoh's hearts and made him strong-willed and stubborn so that he would not set the Israelites free. The 12th century rationalist and legal authority and physician Maimonides is deeply concerned about these verses. He writes extensively about the God-given free will implanted in every human being, and so how could it be that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and why? He notices a pattern in Pharaoh's responses to the plagues. And he sees that at the beginning, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and only later does God intervene and harden Pharaoh's heart. Maimonides explains the change in the pattern, that it reflects human nature. When we are callous and stubborn for a time, it is a conscious choice. It is an act of will. It is something we choose. And then, in time, if we continue to be stubborn and double down again and again, we find that we paint ourselves into a corner, and there's no way out. We feel we have no choice. We must continue down the path that we've committed to, the path that we've begun, even knowing it is a destructive path, a self-destructive path, and destructive for those we love. When we harden our hearts, it seems impossible to soften them. Pharaoh forfeited his own free will. He was addicted to this condition of the heart, and he destroyed himself and his family. He lost his palace, he lost his power, and his whole country suffered. This is one of the great warnings of this week's Torah portion, the danger of hardening a stubborn heart. How do we protect ourselves from it? How do we fill our hearts instead with empathy and compassion, a softness, a tenderness? It can be taught. Our tradition teaches that it can be taught. How are those 10 plagues treated at the Seder table? What is the ritual? We take the cup of wine, which is the symbol of our joy, and we diminish it ever so slightly, one by one. A drop of the sweet wine hits the plate with a thud. That is a ritual to nurture our sense of empathy for the Egyptians who suffered. And Austin mentioned the fast of the firstborn. Why do firstborn children fast on the eve of Pesach? Out of solidarity with the firstborn Egyptian whose life was lost. Rituals are intended to cultivate empathy. Maimonides says a person must train himself in these positive tendencies so that they become permanent within him. One should try once, repeat again and again until the practice is continuous and requires only a slight effort so that it will not become a burden for you. Those tendencies for the good will be a fixed part of your very being. The current coalition Netanyahu has assembled is the hardest right government Israel has ever known since its establishment. Some of its representatives are so driven by fear, they have turned their hearts to stone and have set a destructive path before them, paved with threats of racism, homophobia, misogyny, and as strange as it sounds, also anti-Semitism. Yes, liberal Jews in Israel do not have the same rights and the same government supports as ultra-Orthodox Jews have. And liberal Jews of the diaspora, communities like ours, so devoted to Israel, are ignored, dismissed, and hardly considered by representatives of this current government. Over the last 3 weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are demonstrating in the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, Beersheba, to protest, to stand tall for their democracy, to shout down any threat they may see against their courts, against their vision for the highest ideals of the Jewish state, a vision that was articulated in its founding document, Megillat HaAtzmaut, Israel's Declaration of Independence. Some of you may have heard my pre-Shabbat message last week when I wondered out loud if this is just an anomaly. Sometimes governments disappoint, and then the democracy can swing the pendulum back towards a just and right road. And I wondered out loud if this is a trajectory. Many Israelis are concerned that this is the beginning of a path that will only continue and take us to very dangerous and unrecognizable places. This week I received an email from someone I don't know, but she grew up here at Holy Blossom Temple. Dear Rabbi Splansky, I'll just read excerpts of her letter. I grew up at Holy Blossom Temple and in the Reform movement. Tikkun Olam and Zionism went hand in hand for me and were the main messages that I remember from my youth. Years have since passed. I made Aliyah in 2006. I studied for my master's in social work. I studied law. And now I work as a social worker for women who are victims of violence. I live with my husband and my 3 children in Beersheba. I stood in the rain in Tel Aviv 2 Saturdays ago, slightly sick, but with thousands of others. I took our kids last Saturday night to the smaller protest in Beersheba, and I will take them there again this Saturday night and every Saturday night thereafter for the foreseeable future, because we are in a state of emergency. You wondered in your podcast if the reforms that our government is planning and has begun to carry out may just be a blip, like the Trump years. However, you are wrong to be so optimistic. Israel is not the United States or Canada. We are a fragile democracy. We do not have a constitution. We do not have a Senate and a House of Representatives. We do not have term limits. We do not have a representational democracy. The only checks and balances we have is in our court system and the basic laws, and the judicial overhaul this government is planning is going to destroy them both. All these changes, she writes, are not happening sometime in the future, giving Israelis and Jewish diaspora congregations like yours time to discuss the issues. All these changes are happening at once and quickly. The government is trying to get most of the judicial overhaul passed before Pesach. Therefore, I strongly disagree with the decisions of the reform movement of the diaspora and most Jewish organizations in the diaspora. Now is not the time to hope and pray that things will settle down. Now is not the time for hasbara, for standing with Israel at all costs, she says. Now is not the time to worry what the world might think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because if Israel is no longer a democracy, then the dream and the vision of a Jewish homeland for all Jews will be destroyed. In fact, many of your congregants will not be allowed to make Aliyah because they are not considered Jewish. So as a Jewish Canadian Israeli, I write with a heavy heart to you and to all Jews in the diaspora. Start going to vigils at the Israeli consulates. Start speaking out against the judicial reforms. Start donating to small Israeli NGOs that support democratic values. If the reform movement wants to make a decision based on Zionism and Tikkun Olam, it must take a stand. The new laws will hurt women, the LGBTQ community, non-Orthodox Jews, Palestinian Israeli citizens, and other minorities, and anyone who is perceived as the left. Silence is no longer an option. Speak out and speak out loudly. Stand with Israelis, she says, religious and secular, right-wing and left-wing. Stand as well with Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel who want to continue living in a liberal democracy. Stand with us so that you and your children and your grandchildren can continue to wave the Israeli flags on Yom HaAtzmaut with pride. We need all the help we can get, she writes. I serve currently as the president of the Toronto Board of Rabbis, and on this past Monday, I was fortunate to welcome the Israeli Consul General to speak to our rabbis. And it was a difficult conversation. It was painful for the rabbis to say what they felt needed to be said, and it was painful for the Consul General to hear, and I could tll that she was struggling to find just the right words to respond. And you know that the Israeli ambassador to Canada has resigned. We discussed these things at the Temple Board Thursday evening. One of the many things that I have come to admire about this congregation is its love for Israel. One of the 6 pillars of Holy Blossom's statement of identity is Ahavat Yisrael, a love of Israel. And another thing that I admire about this congregation is that this love comes in many forms, in many expressions, right, left, and center. We are a diverse congregation in that way, and I celebrate it. Just as we have to see hard things in the people that we love, just as we have to concern ourselves with the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of the people we love, just as we have to grapple with the ugly or unseemly traits which show themselves from time to time in the people that we love, so must it be now for the Israel that we love. We have to be willing to see the hard things. We have to be willing to say the hard things. And believe me, it is painful for me to have to say these things to you this Shabbat. So what can we do? First, we need to study up. Rabbi Daniel Hartman, with whom I studied just a few short weeks ago in Jerusalem, tells diaspora Jewry we can no longer simply say it's complicated. That's not good enough when we want to defend Israel and her government. We cannot defend the direction of this government, but we can defend the majority while it is still a majority. And we can reinforce Israel's democracy, which I believe is very strong. And that's what we're seeing playing out in the hearts and the minds and the streets and the courtyards of Israel today. So we have to study up, read the Times of Israel, which is a neutral English publication out of Israel, attend our Israel Dialogues, this extraordinary weekly series, which David DeWitt and Mark Anshin and Howard Edelman and Rabbi Kay and Les Rothschild and others convene for us. Some of the best minds, some of the greatest scholars are coming to teach us every Thursday midday online. I urge you to attend this Sunday's program with representatives from Maram, Israeli Reform rabbis who can tell us heart to heart what they see, what they hear, what they believe to be. And I encourage you to listen to the podcast coming out of the Hartman Institute, an extraordinary faculty of thinkers writing from out of the core of Israel. And now is when we must lean into Israel. With travel, plan your next trip. It's beautiful there. It's delicious there. And the neshama of the Israelis you will meet will melt your heart and remind you why you love Israel. Our teenagers are going on March break with Rabbi Kay and the principal of our school, Lisa Eisenbaumel. They're going to have a blast. And many of us are traveling with the UJA mission so that we can be there for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. I believe spaces are still available with many different tracks of learning and discovery, something for everyone. And if you want to study at the Hartman Institute this summer in June, the details can be found on our website. So lean into Israel. Now is exactly the time to reach out to loved ones who live there, to friends and colleagues and family. And also, let's support like-minded liberal Jews who are doing the heavy lifting there. Support Artsa Canada. If you are a member of Holy Blossom Temple, you are likely a member of Artsa Canada. Go to the website, support it, which will then lead to support for the Israeli movement for progressive Judaism. And if you don't yet know about the Israel Religious Action Center, which is our lobbyist wing, our legal wing in Jerusalem, then go to its website and see how its team of lawyers are doing its utmost to fight racism and homophobia and women's right to defend women's rights and to defend the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, we prayed this morning, may you cause a new light to shine upon Zion, O God. V'nizkechu lanu mehera le'oro, and let us all soon be worthy of its light. And together we say, Amen.